All right, guys, we're going to start with the monkey's paw. Kind of some background on this. This story, you're going to see some British words and some Indian words from India, and it's because India used to be a colony of Britain. So kind of like the Americas were the British colonies, so was India. And so a lot of soldiers or British soldiers were sent over to India, and that's where the Sergeant Major Morris comes in this story. So I kind of wanted to give that background. And so we're going to read part one. Without the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Lebanon Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked a comment from the white-haired lady knitting placidly by the fire. Now, this language is so different. I get it. This was written in 100 years ago. So the wording is going to be different, and it's going to be a little bit of decoding. So because you haven't figured it out, father and son are playing chess. Peril is another word for danger. So basically they're having a kind of a risky game while mom is kind of knitting placidly, which is peacefully by the fire. Hark at the wind, said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. And hark means to listen. So listen to the wind is what he's telling him, trying to divert his son's attention. I'm listening, said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. Check. I should think that he'd hardly come tonight, said his father, with his hand poised over the board. Mate, replied the son. That's the worst of living so far out, bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live, and this is the worst. Pathways a bog, and the roads a torrent. And I don't know what people were thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses on the road are let, they think it doesn't matter. So obviously they're expecting a visitor, and it's not really good weather outside, and the roads are bad. And, during 1900, people had to walk a lot of places. So he's waiting for his visitor, and he doesn't think he's going to come because of, the weather. Never mind, dear, said the wife soothingly. Perhaps you'll win next time. Mr. White looked up sharply just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he had a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. There he is, said Herbert White as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste and opened the door, and he was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mr. White said tut-tut and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. He was just a character, a big guy. He just stood out. That's what all those fancy words mean. Sergeant Major Morris, he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watching contentedly while his host got out the whiskey and the tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter and he began to talk. The little family circle regarding with eager interest the visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of strange seeds and doughty deeds. And doughty means, courageous deeds of war and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. So Sergeant Major Morris has been in the military for 21 years, and he was obviously stationed a lot of places. And so when it says that, he spoke of strange scenes and brave and courageous things and wars and plagues, for the whites who have never been anywhere, this is really interesting. And, they want to hear these stories. All right, so let's continue. He don't look like to have taken much harm, said Miss White politely. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man, just to look around a bit, Better where you are, said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down his empty glass and sighed softly. Then he shook it again. So, no offense, like when my friends tell me that they have visited this place and I'm like, oh, I'd love to go visit. They're like, yeah, you should. But the sergeant major doesn't say that. He says, better where you are. So, better where you are. Like, you're better off here. I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me about the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? And just so you know, the fakirs are a Muslim or Hindu religious person, kind of considered almost a medicine man or some kind of witch doctor. So that's what that means. And so he says, you were telling me about something the other day. And so the soldier says, nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastways, nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw? Said Miss White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down. His host filled it for him. To look at it, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket, it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it, and in case you don't know, that just means offered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. Now, what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men each could have 3 separate wishes from it. This paragraph is super important to the story. So a fakir, which is like a witch doctor and medicine man, put a spell on this, and he did it because he wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives. Like, you can't interfere with fate. What's meant to be is meant to be. And if you tried to interfere with it, you would do so to your sorrow. And we all know that means sadness. And then he tells us that 3 separate men, can each make 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in a way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Miss White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tipped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Inquired the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were for, but the third was for death. That's how I got this paw. Now, we've all seen Aladdin. If I got 3 wishes, I'd be super pumped. I would be excited, but this man is not excited about his wishes. He actually said the man before him had it, and he doesn't know what his first 2 wishes for, but the last one was for death. And then this is how Sergeant Major got the paw. His tone was so grave that a hush fell upon the group, and grave means very serious. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw. Make sure I'm right. He took the paw and dangled it between his front finger and his thumb, and then he suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, scooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the old man, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it in the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happened. Pitch it in the fire again, like a sensible man. So he's pitching this in the fire. White goes and gets it. And he's pretty much telling his friend, burn it. If you have any sense about you, burn it and get rid of it. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it in your right hand and wish aloud. said the sergeant major. But I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Miss White, as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all three burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. So the wife's just joking around. And it's like, give me 4 hands, like 4 sets of hands, 4 pairs of hands. She's a wife. She's got to cook, clean, do the laundry and stuff. And she was just joking around. And this immediately freaks Sergeant Major Morris out. And he's like, if you must wish for something sensible. That makes sense. Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table in the business of supper. The talisman, which is anything that has a remarkable power or influence, which is the monkey's paw. The talisman was partially forgotten, and afterward the three sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind the guest just in time for him to catch the last train, we shan't make much of it. Did you get anything for it? Said the father. I gave him a trifle, or inquired Miss White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, he said, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpicked, which means kind of fooled. He darted around the table, pursued by the malign Miss White, armed with Annie Macassar. She's cleaning up. That's what she's doing. He darted around the table. Miss White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. And we already know dubiously means questionable, not trusting. I don't know what to wish for. And that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me that I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'll just do it. And clearing the house means just to pay off the house. Wish to pay off the house. That's a sensible wish for all people. Nobody wants a house payment. So, paying off the house costs 200 pounds. So, there's nothing, that's a great wish. His father smiled shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son held up where am I at? With his hand on his shoulder. Well, Lord have mercy, sorry. His father, smiling shamefaced at his own credulity, his ability to believe it, he's kind of laughing at himself. He doesn't believe it's going to do anything. Held up the talisman at his son with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran towards him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hands, like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table. I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously, which means he's kind of saying, Father, you just you imagine that. He shook his head. Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it did give me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of the door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert, as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. And you can see the son's very joking about this. He doesn't believe any of this is going to happen. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. So weird. He's sitting in the fire and he's seeing these faces in it. And the last face was so horrible and so simian, which is evil, that He gazed at it in amazement. It was so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. And we're going to stop here for the day. You need to go answer your questions. And if you have this available to hear me reread and stop.